traits and cultural diversity that makes this world such an interesting place. So I think it is extremely important as we move forward not to superimpose values that are perhaps suitable for certain societies, and we're all fine with that.
Give me an example about what you mean.
I think in various things, I think a lot of values about, for example, dividing the world into democratic states and authoritarian states. I think this is a binary view that just doesn't work, because really there are so many shades of gray between this end of the spectrum and that end of spectrum. I think if you accept the concept of respecting diversity, then really that acceptance of diversity really cascades down to everything that you look into. So it's not a single example here, but really it's a call for the world not to look at issues and look at areas of interest in a binary view.
Interesting. We seem to be entering this new era of globalization, where at the moment it feels like bilateral relations are taking precedence over potential multilateral.
Let me put it this way. You know, we saw a certain kind of globalization acquire a great deal of momentum, probably from the mid-90s till about 5 years ago, 7 years ago. A lot of it was propelled economically. It was facilitated by technology, very driven by investment. But it also created exactly the point which Dr. Anwar mentioned, a kind of globalization ideology. Ideology that there is one globalization and there's one truth, one narrative, and a certain narrow set of people who will define what is right and what is wrong. And what happened was very interesting. Within societies, because globalization produced inequalities within societies. For example, you saw even in the United States, there was a hollowing out of the industrial economy. It created a backlash. It also created problems between societies. So you had actually a very interesting phenomena, I would say, certainly argumentation in the world about globalization. I think it's right now one of the most important debates. And you know, when I spoke initially about rebalancing, we've seen political rebalancing. Many more states express political views. We've seen economic rebalancing. The GDP's share of global economy has changed. But to my mind, one of the toughest disputations we are now entering is really cultural rebalancing, which is who gets to define what is right and what is wrong, what is normal and what is not, what is correct and what is not. And I think today that's a very, very big issue in international relations.
Interesting. Dr. Anwar, I'd love you to give your view on this idea of bilateral relations versus a multilateral approach. Do you see that?
Well, again, I think we can speak about, and this is also perhaps, a reductionism, so to speak. but we can speak about bilateralism, multilateralism, or we can speak also about a smaller multilateralism, which is also proving very effective today. I think bilateral relations usually are easier to manage or more difficult to manage, depending the trajectory that you are actually going on. But I think they are usually much more effective, of course. But they're not a replacement for multilateralism, because there are many issues, and I think climate is a good example where it just cannot be dealt with bilaterally. But I think more and more, and I think here in things that we are doing with India, you can see that in some of the smaller relationships, and then you see this in the I2U2 as an example, you have the potential of agility and at the same time of effectiveness, because you are not trying to move 30 states or 50 states or whatever, but you have more or less a much smaller number of states that have a certain common interest in a certain area. So I think every successful foreign policy has to work on all these different levels, because each level actually has its pros and cons.
You know, if I could just add to that, I mean, if I take India and UAE, I mean, we have to do our CPA. So it's a kind of today, you know, there's so many issues and so many variables and so many platforms. The truthful answer to your question is kind of all of the above. You've got to work every opportunity and every platform to get the best results.
Well, let's take one of these examples and let's look in particular at COP27, finished recently. I'd love to hear directly what went right and what could have gone better.
We are looking at each other. I will yield to my host as a matter of courtesy.
Okay. As the host of the next COP.
I think, you know, again, I look at it not as an expert in climate change. I look at it more from a political, let's say, perspective. So I think COP, I think the main thing was really the framework of addressing concerns of developing nations. Of course, we still have to put all the details and the working mechanism in place. I would say that this is the big breakthrough there. But on the other hand, of course, we know that we are slipping on commitments that were made in Paris. And I think this is something that we do really need to work diligently together in order to address that. So I wouldn't say that something went wrong, but I think that the international system is not as effective and as quick as it should be in addressing what we are really seeing, the effects and the ravages of climate as we move forward. But definitely, I think also what is extremely important, and especially from the perspective of a country like the UAE, which is quite bullish and working very hard on sustainable energy, but is at the same time a hydrocarbon economy, this realization that the transition is not going to happen overnight and will also need for everybody to understand that it will need a parallel hydrocarbon support for countries like India and like us and other countries that still need to develop their economies, address societal requirements in education and in housing and in infrastructure, etc. So I think the big takeaway has definitely been addressing the concern of support for developing economies, but we do need to move much faster.
If, you know, I could add to it, and it's not COP27. I think whatever challenges precede COP27, they will carry on beyond COP27. There are two parts to it, really. One is the climate action part, which is, do you have the capabilities and the deployabilities and the efficiencies and the economies really to put in place a set of, you can say, options out there or practices out there so that our growth is greener. You know, my sense is that's much more about global business, about public policy, about sharing, etc. There's the other part, which is the tougher part, which is climate justice. And the climate justice part is that the promises which have been made to the developing world, essentially, it's like those who are occupying carbon space have kept promising that they would help others. And frankly, they've kept shortchanging the world. And they come up every COP with some, you know, some new argument, some evasion, something which keeps kicking the can down the road. So the real problem you're facing today is that of the rest of the world. But yet you'll say, well, you know, they're a big emitter, so maybe they should step forward. Hello, this was not the country which occupied the carbon space. So somewhere people need to, you know, be truthful about it and say, you know, who's really responsible for the global warming? And the countries which are need to step up.
I can hear an element of frustration in your voice as you speak.
I thought it was an element of truth, but I'm prepared to settle for your word.
So what should we be doing differently? And how can we move forward? Because as you say, it's happened year after year, COP after COP.
Well, look, the fact is, if on the one hand, we truly believe this is existential. You know, how can you say it is existential and I don't have the money to deal with it? You know, either it's existential and you put everything you have, or it's not. And you're actually sort of, as I say, you're not really willing to walk the talk. Now, the fact is, there have been other situations where countries have been willing to put up money. You know, so it's not like there isn't the resources. And again, this idea that, well, you know, private financing, that's one of the narratives which emerged a little bit later when people really didn't want to pay up. You know, private financing will take care of it. You know, private financing will follow. Private financing cannot lead. Governments have to lead. Multilateral development banks need to lead. And this is one of the big issues, I think, which a large part of the world is grappling with. You know, unfortunately, much of that world is not heard today because the global conversations are very one-sided.
There did seem to be some movement around the idea of reforming the Bretton Woods institutions, and that seemed to come during the conversation. Would you say that that's true? Were you heartened by that?
I would say it's something which needs to be done. I would defer to Dr. Anwar here. I'm not, you know, let me put it politely. I think there's a lot of hard work ahead of us.
Yeah.
Right?
What would you add?
Definitely.
So one of your colleagues, Dr. Anwar, said that the world's failure to invest enough in fossil fuels before cleaner alternatives can fully meet today's energy needs is a recipe for disaster. So what should we be doing differently now?
Well, I think we need, there's several things that need to be done. I think first of all is we need to work collectively. This is not a national issue, it's a global crisis. So continuing to work quickly, collectively is extremely important. I think at the same time, we need to move faster also. And I think part of it also is the climate justice that Dr. Jaishankar just spoke about. I think that is essential because various countries, you can't tell them because of climate, you can't also at the same time not develop the infrastructure, the sort of social mobility, economic mobility of your population because you miss the boat. I think this is totally unacceptable in various ways. I think from our emphasis, we have been trying to also be realistic while seeing that while we are all focused on sustainable energy, taking a larger part in the energy mix, we also understand, and I think this has been very clear in the last year or so, that there's a lot of Middle East region have a very solid, almost 15 years or more of believing in sustainable energy and the necessity of addressing climate. We've been the first country to buy into the Paris Accords. We have been at the same time we have been also at the same time the first country with the net zero results. We have invested heavily in solar. We have invested heavily in solar. We have various investments that show our trust in this course that we are taking. And we're, of course, looking forward to COP28. And what we want to do in COP28 is to try and get out with a lot of actionable results in that perspective.
Interesting. I'll let you recover from your cough. You all right? Okay. You said, I would love to hear a little bit more, Dr. Jaishankar, because we saw COP27, one of those places where India yet again is emerging as a pivotal country between the East and the West, the North and the South. And we've also seen that in the G20 as well. And there's been praise for the Indian delegation of the G20 working really hard to seek consensus between Moscow and the Western camp. And you've said yourself that the war in Ukraine is actually sucking up oxygen in Europe. I'd love you to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you.
That one.
Sorry about the cough. Well, look, I think we have two big divides today. One, you could say, is a kind of East-West divide, centering around Ukraine. One is a North-South divide, centering around development. And Ukraine is also having an impact on development. So I do believe a country like India can play that bridging role, not alone. I think UAE, for example, can, in a sense, has also been doing some of it. So would some other countries. But there is the need today to bridge. That's.
Do you want to add to that, Dr. Anwar?
Yes, I think we all want to see a quick end to the conflict in Ukraine. And we all believe also that this conflict will not end except politically and through a political process. I think it is in our interest to make sure that there is a political process that ends this conflict. But I think also that, at least from the UAE's perspective, I think our position on the conflict in Ukraine has been a very principled position. I think from as a country our size in this region, I think we don't accept that conflict is resolved through military means, and at the same time we think that in this international system, sovereignty has to be protected and sovereignty has to be respected. But while we're saying that, the devices that need to be used are political devices. It should be political process that will resolve this. It should be a political process that will ensure that conditions following the end of conflict in Ukraine are not the sort of conditions that will bring about another conflict in a few years. I think only a political process is able to do that, to address the Ukraine issue, but at the same time ensure that grievances do not bring about another conflict out of the way that this thing has been resolved.
So let's talk a little bit more about technology. You've both mentioned the partnership between the UAE and India. Dr. Jaishankar, you've said recently that the rise of India will be deeply linked to the rise of Indian technology. And it is a tried and tested tool for spurring economic improvement. But technology nationalism can also be vaccines. So I wonder how you avoid technology nationalism while encouraging technology growth.
Well, again, I think the UAE has benefited from globalization and has benefited from a world that has been more of an open, competitive, trading and ideas actually platform. So really we do look with concern at the sort of technology nationalism that you have spoken about. But we understand that at the root of these concerns is political issues. These are not, at the root, are not technological issues. They are national security issues, political issues, and I think we need to accept that while this sort of tension is in the international system, there will be a ripple effect. There will be a ripple effect on how we trade, there will be a ripple effect on how we invest, there will be a ripple effect on how we sort of work in technology, collaborating rather than always competing. This is a sort of world that we are moving into, following the sort of naivete of the early globalism. It's not a good place to be in, to be honest, but I think at the same time there are political reasons, there are national security reasons. I think for us, a country our size, in our region, this is a tougher world to navigate. But that's the way it is, and we have to navigate it.
Look, it's natural technology would be nationally used. So we shouldn't pretend that something has fundamentally changed. Oh, everything has fundamentally changed. There will be national competitions based on technological capabilities. Different nations, different groupings of nations asserting their influence or dominance or whatever you call it. That's for real. That's the part which I said, the constant competition among nations. But there are some real issues out there. Globalization is going to make us work collaboratively because it's in our mutual interest. But if you come, say, to some parts, let's say digital technology, there's a real debate going on today about trust and transparency, about, are all all countries, all companies, all providers the same? Does it matter to you under which law, regulation, ethos your data is residing? I think we can't run away from those issues. So if you ask me, will we see, in a sense, disputation, argumentation, maybe stronger in the technology world? Absolutely. I don't think it's a matter of prediction. I think it's already there. So we need to start taking positions.
And it's not just nation states that have a stake in this game either. It's companies as well, right? So let's talk for a moment about the technological hegemony of some of the big Western companies at the moment. Vaccines or tweets, a lot of the intellectual capital for technology innovation is controlled by some of these larger Western companies. And in fact, Dr. Jaishankar, I think you have over 2 million followers on Twitter. I wonder, in your world, in your better world actually, what do global technology platforms look like?
Yeah, look, again, you know, today you have tech companies. If you took their market cap and sort of put it up against the national economies of countries, I suspect some of them may qualify for a G20. You know, some of them
Would you welcome them?
Some of them are that big. It's again, these are new issues that are emerging. And in the name of, as I said, narrative setting, political correctness, we can't keep ducking these issues. It does matter. For example, I'm giving you now an Indian perspective. You know, do tech companies have the same rules when it comes to cooperating on, say, national security matters? You know, which countries would they respond to, which governments would they respond to, which would they not?
Which countries should they respond to?
Certainly countries like India. So I don't know who else. I presume they will respond to countries in there. But, you know, everything else, I'm not saying everything in the world should be regulated, but there are accepted norms and practices and sort of operating ethos. So if really you have big enterprises which have monetized data through their particular models, in the name of, shall I say, freedom, would you leave them completely to decide what they should be doing once they've reached that stage? I mean, there are some live controversies going on. I mean, I'm not getting into that, but you know that and I know that. So the idea that somewhere tech is neutral geopolitically, tech is neutral within societies, it's not true. They've not been. Think about it.
What does this look like from your perspective, Dr. Anwar?
Well, again, as I said, I mean, technology, number one, is a great wealth creator. I mean, huge wealth for countries, for companies, is being created for technology. I think at the same time, technology provides developmental leaps. Many countries, through technology, can actually create a 5 or 10-year leap because they are big on AI or big on this or that. So I think it's definitely not neutral, as Dr. Jaishankar said. I think from our perspective, I think what is important, the UAE, for example, this year, for the first time, hit or is hitting $500 billion in GDP. So we really understand this is our first time that we do hit this number, and for a country our size to have a GDP that size is quite extraordinary. But I think we understand also that to continue this sort of development, we need to invest in technology, we need to partner in technology and to navigate our way right now, along as with what you were saying is more technology nationalism. But I think that's the way things are, and then we need to deal with it.
If I could just, in a sense, build further on what both of us said. Given the centrality of technology to our existence, to our businesses, to our progress, we are going to need to factor it in more and more, both in governance and in international relations. So, again, I'm giving you the data side of it as an easy example. I think a lot of societies, I certainly would speak for mine, today feel the need to be comfortable about trusted providers when it comes to an area like telecom. Okay. Similarly, there would be countries who would worry about cross-border data flows. You know, who's handling it? Now, companies are obviously crucial, but all companies, you know, and all destinations and all societies are not the same. So we have to, you know, we can't make it a kind of a theology that, you know, companies are safe and the problem is with the countries. Companies are part of a country. I mean, countries don't run businesses, or at least most of them don't, some do. So I think we are entering this domain where, if I were to say the next 10 years, the big arguments and the big maneuverings are going to be around technology. It's going to be around data, it's going to be around chips, it's going to be around AI, it's going to be around space. I could give you more examples.
So that's interesting, because you mentioned in your opening remarks the cooperation between the UAE and India around some of these other areas like space, like AI. Tell me a little bit about how that partnership, you think, will help you individually as well as create this new kind of globalization.
Well, again, I would like to echo Dr. Jaishankar's enthusiasm really about the bilateral relationship. I think this gives me an opportunity to come and sort of reflect on what has been really a wonderful, wonderful trajectory of the bilateral relationship since 2015. What we have achieved in 7 years has been remarkable. And I think, you know, Dr. Jaishankar did not perhaps mention this, but I think leadership, really Prime Minister Modi's leadership and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's leadership in this has been a major catalyst here.
I just thought everybody knew that.
Okay. But, you know, I mean, to start with, a historical relationship. And this is a relationship where we've always had the private sector ahead of the curve of government. I think right now, the government is giving the private sector a run in leading this relationship. And I think what has happened is incredible. I mean, since 2015, the milestones are just too many to sort of catalog, and they're all over. So what was really a good relationship, an excellent relationship, has become a strategic and fit for the future relationship, if I can describe it in that way. I mean, if you really think about it, SEPA, I was speaking to the Indian ambassador, Sanjay Sudhir, only last week, and he was telling me, we don't really have the official figures yet, but we are seeing about a 30% increase in trade following the signing of SEPA in February. And our target really is to reach trading levels of $100 billion with India. These are with India, $100 billion.
This year.
Yeah, $100 billion with India. So really, where can we get all that extra sort of, you know, sort of revenue streams, so to speak, in the relationship? I think technology is one of the major things. I mean, we're doing things in space, we are doing things in oil, we are doing things in food security, you name it. It's really across the board. The UAE today, I think, is the 10th FDI player in India today, and I think this is quite significant. But I think the real added advantage is what we do on technology. If we are able to harness technology, make sure that we can work together in various areas of technology within our bilateral and, as I said, multilateral, smaller multilateral forums, I think you will see that the remarkable achievements of the past 7 years will really pale in front of what we are really seeing in a truly, truly promising relationship.
Interesting. We've run out of time. One final thought from you.
I give you two final thoughts. One, in this period when our relationship has been very strong, we've also discovered, for example, during COVID, how firmly we stood by each other, in terms of handling community, we kept our food supplies flowing, the cooperation we had on vaccines. So in a world where we are going to get more disruptions due to conflict or COVID or climate or whatever, the reliability today of relationship between India and UAE, I think sets it apart. That's my first point. The second point is, the UAE is following its transformational path. A lot of us here are familiar with it. India is doing its own. Now, it so happens that the two paths have the ability to support each other. And
can I just mention an anecdote, if you allow me? Again, during COVID, early COVID time, Dr. Jaishankar called our foreign minister, and he was responsible for the distribution of vaccines. And he called and said, I'm looking and seeing that you have requested 200,000 vaccines from India. Are you sure this is all you want? We can give you 2 million if you want. And I think this sort of, this touches you, because really I think what has really happened to this relationship is this reservoir of trust. I think the trust that underpins any relationship really makes you do wonderful things, and I think this is what we have been doing.
Thank you. That seems an appropriate moment to end this panel, or should we say press pause, because I can see that the collaboration will continue. We're going to break in a moment, but
You care for your bones every day. Why not care for your lungs? Use Daikin Air Purifier every day. Everyday care for everyday air.
The weight of different nations and different regions in the world have changed in the last many decades. And a lot of that derives from globalization. Some of it is autonomous of globalization. And so when you think today of which are the crucial regions, which are the important countries, rebalancing tells you that they're not the same, or not the same to the same extent as before. As rebalancing advances, I would pick a third concept, multipolarity, which is that some nations and maybe some groupings have acquired that they're regarded in the international system as one of the poles. And the number of poles from an era 75 years ago where we thought in binary terms of the US and the USSR, or the West and the East, today you actually have more independent or autonomous centers of decision making. So the more rebalancing carries on, the more we are going to see the emergence of multipolarity. So the flow in that sense would be the deeper that globalization gets, the more you're going to see rebalancing. The more rebalancing you get, the more you're going to see the emergence of multipolarity. But having said all this, it's also true that there are the constant practices and traditions of international relations that remain at work. International relations are still primarily defined by the nation state, by competition and collaboration among nation states, by convergences among them. So while we often tend to talk about the changes, and rightly tend to talk about the changes in the world, I think it's important, particularly for practitioners of not just diplomacy, of anybody who has anything to do in the world, to remind themselves that while the world changes, there are constant factors at work. There are sometimes historical factors at work. So my description today for the state of the world, for all the advancements of economy, of technology, the progress we see even of connectivity, that about 3 decades ago, the world was described, not literally, as a time of the end of history. I think today we are seeing a time of the return of history. Return of history in the sense of countries and regions which were relatively more dormant or less able, less capable, now actually seeking out more space, offering more capabilities, exercising more influence, taking on more responsibilities. So it is definitely a very different world. It's also different because both the past and the future is equally embedded in the present. Now, if we were to speak about the return of history in this part of the world, I think a very natural example of that is India-UAE relationship. Because if you look at our ties, in fact, are ties which are defined by the monsoon, by the most basic forms of mobility when people waited for wind behind their back to take them to where they wanted to do business. And it isn't just that we have a tradition. In that tradition, there are actually centuries of comfort. That if you look at the ability of India and the UAE but is not just intrinsic, it's often intuitive. There are a lot of things we don't need to say. There are times when we may occasionally have a different perspective. Even that is often expressed quite subtly between us. So when I look at the return of history and the relationships which will go forward in the coming days, I certainly would rank the India-UAE relationship very high in that. And there are many reasons. I think the two very obvious ones are one, of course, the UAE is today India's third largest trade partner. It is our second largest export market. And the second, that more Indian citizens live in UAE than in any other country abroad. So whether we are talking people or whether we are talking business, this country has a particular salience in our perspectives. Now, what has been the change in this relationship? I think we have seen on the bilateral side, actually, especially after Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2015, a visit which took place after more than 4 decades at that level, we've actually seen a veritable transformation in our ties. Our as I pointed out, certainly our trade and investment has gone up. But if I were again to pick a defining moment or a defining decision of that change, it would be the SICA. The fact that we were able to conclude a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement so quickly and has led to such effective results thereafter, I think speaks really volumes for the relationship. And we are now moving into new areas. Today, our discussions are about space, it's about education, it's about artificial intelligence, it's about health, it's about startups. So again, the traditional energy, trade, investments, those continue. But a new agenda is also coming into being, and to my mind, that is something that would really redefine this relationship and help it go to a higher orbit. The second aspect of this relationship today is our ability and our effort at actually expanding it to other partners with whom we have mutual comfort. Right now, to me, the obvious example of that is France. We have just this year taken our trilateral with France to a ministerial level. We certainly want to expand that. But we're also, India and UAE, doing more things together in other geographies. Africa is an example. We together have are exploring the possibility of health cooperation in Africa. And then, if I were to sort of go a little bit broader in the canvas, I would cite to you the establishment of the I2U2 mechanism between India, Israel, UAE, and the United States as yet another example of how our changed relationship, India and UAE, is now beginning to have a broader ripple impact. The fact that it is fitting into actually transformations which are independently underway in this region and often helping to take the direction of that transformation forward. So the picture I see today of India and UAE is really of two countries, very comfortable, who've known each other a long time, but who've rediscovered, in a sense, the relationship in the last decade, and who want to use the relationship today in a changing world, not just to survive in a changing world, but to shape a changing world. So it is in many ways a very ambitious relationship because it's not limited really by its bilateral possibilities. It's certainly today having a regional impact, but I'm very confident that as we get deeper into the relationship, it will also make itself felt at the global level. So once again, I want to say I'm really delighted to be with all of you this morning. I wanted to set a tone, not because everybody wants to necessarily start a conference optimistically, they should, but I wanted to set a tone because as someone who, along with Dr. Anwar, we have been witnesses to this transformation of this relationship from inside the room. So I want to share with you that confidence, that sense of confidence inside the room about where this relationship is going, and I hope that at the rest of the conference you will be able to build on that sentiment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaishankar. Don't go too far away. I'll have you back up on the stage in just a moment. You spoke there about the partnership and the many different connections between India and the UAE, including the comprehensive economic partnership that covers everything from bilateral business opportunities to how the two nations can partner for global impact on critical regional
कि सड़क के दोनों तरफ लोग बेसब्री से इंतजार कर रहे हैं, प्रतीक्षा कर रहे हैं प्रधानमंत्री के रोड शो की। ये आप तस्वीरें देखिए, प्रधानमंत्री का स्वागत करने के लिए लोग सड़कों पर किस तरह से खड़े हुए हैं। और प्रधानमंत्री का जो रोड शो है, अब तक का सबसे लंबा रोड शो, करीब करीब 50 से 51 किलोमीटर का रोड शो, वो शुरू हो चुका है और उसका इंतजार जो है लोग सड़कों के किनारे कर रहे हैं। ये सीधी तस्वीर आप देखें
अशोक जी, जो लेकिन रफ्तार से प्रधानमंत्री का काफिला दिखाई पड़ता था, आप उससे क्या भारत की विकास की रफ्तार को जोड़ते हुए देख रहे हैं? वो रफ्तार कुछ कहती है?
देखिए, विकास की रफ्तार तो आज देखिए, आज एक इंपॉर्टेंट डे है। G20 के बारे में आपने हमने अभी खबर भी दी, तो आप देखिए किस तरह से भारत की वैश्विक रूप से किस तरह से प्रतिष्ठा जो है, किस तरह से भारत की चमक दमक जो है दुनिया में बढ़ रही है। तो वो रफ्तार तो थी, लेकिन अभी आप देखेंगे वो रफ्तार इसलिए थी क्योंकि ये काफिला शुरू हुआ है, ये रोड शो शुरू हुआ है। लेकिन जब प्रधानमंत्री पब्लिक के बीच आएंगे तो वो रफ्तार नहीं रह पाएगी, क्योंकि तब जो है प्रधानमंत्री की जो एक कनेक्ट, एक पूरा लोगों के साथ मिलने का, लोगों के साथ कनेक्ट करने की जो भाव होती है, उसके कारण आप देखिएगा जगह जगह प्रधानमंत्री लोगों को हाथ हिला के अभिवादन करेंगे, लोगों से मिलेंगे, लोगों से बात करेंगे। और इसके अलावा आप ये भी देखेंगे, क्योंकि ये रोड शो बहुत लंबा है, करीब करीब 51 किलोमीटर का है और 14 विधानसभाओं को कवर करेगा। आर्यन, ये इंपॉर्टेंट बात है, 14 विधानसभाएं कवर करेगा, जिसमें से 13 विधानसभाएं जो है वो दरअसल अहमदाबाद की हैं, एक विधानसभा गांधीनगर की है, दक्षिण गांधीनगर की। तो वहां से प्रधानमंत्री मिलेंगे और प्रधानमंत्री अभी जो है 2 दिन तक गुजरात में रहेंगे और लोगों से कनेक्ट करने का मीडियम है, एक माध्यम है रोड शो के जरिए लोगों से मिलने का, लोगों से कनेक्ट करने का। ये जो है उसका एक जो बड़ा भव्य नजारा जो है कुछ घंटों तक हमें।
अशोक जी, अक्सर हम देखते हैं रैलियां होती हैं, एक जगह होती है, निश्चित जगह होती है, वहां पे बड़ी संख्या में लोग आते हैं, लेकिन 50-52 किलोमीटर
ये आप देखिए लोगों ने किस तरह से स्वागत करने के लिए
रंगोली बनाई
है। ये गुजरात की एक परंपरा है। आप देखते हैं नवरात्रों में जगह जगह ऐसे होता है, यहाँ पर प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी यहाँ भी पहुंचेंगे तो लोगों ने रंगोली भी बना रखी है, लोग खड़े हैं प्रधानमंत्री का स्वागत करने के लिए, प्रधानमंत्री के कटआउट लगे हैं और प्रतीक्षा कर रहे हैं।
50 से 52 किलोमीटर की दूरी और सड़क के दोनों ओर हजारों लोगों का हुजूम ये दिखाता है कि जो स्वीकारता है, जिस प्रकार से लोग प्रधानमंत्री के इस्तकबाल के लिए सड़कों के दोनों ओर खड़े हुए हैं, ये उस प्यार को दर्शाता है जो प्रधानमंत्री को बीते इतने वर्षों में, इतने दशकों में लगातार गुजरात से मिलता रहा। और शायद इसीलिए वो अपने आप को गुजरात के बेटे के तौर पर लगातार कहते हैं और वो जुड़ाव लोगों के साथ हमेशा उस बात को महसूस करते हैं। हमारे सहयोगी शैलेंद्र मिश्र भी इस खबर पर अधिक बातचीत के लिए हमारे साथ में जुड़े हुए। शैलेंद्र, तस्वीरें बहुत कुछ बयां कर रही हैं, लोगों का इंतजार, और कितनी देर में अब खत्म होगा प्रधानमंत्री के इस रोड शो की शुरुआत को लेकर आपके पास क्या जानकारी?
देखिए, अब ज्यादा देर नहीं है जब प्रधानमंत्री के इस रोड शो को देखेंगे और जैसा कि बता भी रहे थे कि अब तक का सबसे बड़ा रोड शो है, तकरीबन 51 किलोमीटर लंबा है, जो अहमदाबाद के अलग अलग विधानसभाओं से गुजरेगा। गांधीनगर की एक विधानसभा है, 1 दर्जन से ज्यादा विधानसभाओं से ये रोड शो गुजरेगा और कई जगह पर माल्यार्पण का कार्यक्रम भी रखा गया है, जो है सरदार पटेल की, पूरे रास्ते में तमाम महापुरुषों की प्रतिमा भी बनेगी। उसमें कई जगहों पर प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी रुकेंगे और वहाँ पर पुष्पांजलि अर्पित करेंगे। ऐसा कहा जा रहा है। निश्चित तौर पर अभी तक कह सकते हैं, हमने पहले चरण में देखा था कि सूरत में एक भव्य रोड शो प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी का देखने को मिला था पहले चरण में, चुनाव प्रचार होने से पहले, और उससे भी ये बड़ा रोड शो है और अभी तक का सबसे बड़ा रोड शो, जिसमें 1 दर्जन से ज्यादा विधानसभा, इसमें गुजरात के मुख्यमंत्री जहाँ से चुनाव लड़ रहे हैं उनकी विधानसभा भी आती है, वहाँ से रोड शो गुजरेगा। निश्चित तौर पर जो आप जिक्र कर रहे थे, जब तस्वीरों में देखते हैं इस तरह के जो रोड शो होते हैं, किस तरह से कनेक्ट होता है प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी का। हमने देखा एक तस्वीर में लोग परिवार के साथ आए हैं, छोटे छोटे बच्चों को साथ लाए हैं प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी को नजदीक से दिखाने के लिए, और ये दिखाता है गुजरात में, खासतौर पर अहमदाबाद में, सूरत में किस तरह से प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की एक लोकप्रियता है, और वो जब रोड शो, इस तरह के रोड शो होते हैं तब उससे झलकती है। और आज का रोड शो कई मायनों में इसलिए खास होने वाला है क्योंकि चुनाव के इतिहास में कभी इतना बड़ा रोड शो नेता द्वारा नहीं किया गया है, और ऐसे में इतना बड़ा रोड शो जब सड़कों के दोनों किनारे हम देख रहे हैं, अभी से जो लोग हैं दूसरे छोर तक वो सड़कों तक इंतजार कर रहे हैं, सड़कों पर आ गए हैं, उत्साहित हैं, प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी को नजदीक से देखना चाहते हैं। निश्चित तौर पर वैश्विक नेता की एक जो प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की छवि है, दुनिया के सबसे लोकप्रिय नेता के तौर पर जाने जाते हैं। गुजरात की धरती पर जब अहमदाबाद में रोड शो के लिए निकलने वाले हैं तो निश्चित तौर पर सभी को इंतजार है जब वो अपने प्रिय नेता को बहुत नजदीक से देख पाएंगे, उनका अभिवादन कर पाएंगे, उनका अभिनंदन कर पाएंगे और उनसे अगर मौका मिला तो कुछ क्षण उनको बहुत नजदीक से देख पाएंगे। तो निश्चित तौर पर सभी को इंतजार है और बीजेपी के लिए आज का एक दिन एक तरह से कह सकते हैं कि गुजरात की राजनीति में एक ऐतिहासिक दिन होने वाला है जब गुजरात के चुनावी राजनीति के इतिहास में हम कहें कि सबसे बड़े रोड शो का दिन है आज अहमदाबाद में जो एक दर्जन से ज्यादा विधानसभाओं से गुजरेगा। तो निश्चित तौर पर एक तरह से कहें कि बहुत उत्साह का माहौल है बीजेपी कार्यकर्ताओं में, आम लोगों में और हम छोटे-छोटे बच्चों को भी देख रहे हैं जो अपने परिवार के साथ आए हैं या फिर अपने घर के पास खड़े हैं प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी के रोड शो को देखने के लिए आ रहे हैं।
शैलेंद्र, आप रहिए हमारे साथ हमारे वरिष्ठ सहयोगी अशोक श्रीवास्तव भी मेरे साथ लगातार स्टूडियो में मौजूद। अशोक जी, आप भी लगातार अभी गुजरात का दौरा करते रहे, आपने तमाम राजनीतिक कार्यक्रमों को भी किया है, जनता से संवाद किया, किस तरीके का एक माहौल इस वक्त है, क्योंकि आज पहले दौर की वोटिंग है और दूसरे के लिए इतना बड़ा रोड शो, गुजरात इस वक्त राजनीति के लिहाज से कहां पे खड़ा है और कैसे एक नई करवट को लेकर आगे बढ़ने के लिए दिखाई पड़ रहा है?
देखिए, 27 साल से बीजेपी का वहाँ शासन है और नरेंद्र मोदी, प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की बात करेंगे तो 2001 से लेकर 2014 तक वो गुजरात के मुख्यमंत्री रहे। अब तक सबसे लंबे समय तक गुजरात की सेवा करने का, गुजरात के मुख्यमंत्री पद पर रहने का जो सौभाग्य है वो नरेंद्र मोदी को मिला। उसके बाद वो देश के प्रधानमंत्री बने। तो उनका सफर जो गांधीनगर से शुरू होकर के सीधा दिल्ली तक आया, उस सफर के बीच में जो है, उस सफर में गुजरात की अपनी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंस है और ये बात सब लोग समझते हैं। देखिए, ये जो चुनाव है ये अपने आप में इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि ये चुनाव में पहली बार चुनावी लड़ाई हुई है, लेकिन इसके बावजूद बीजेपी इस बार अपना सबसे बड़ा लक्ष्य लेकर, ये आप देखिए प्रधानमंत्री के कारों का काफिला जो है अब और ये बात मैं नरेंद्र आपको बताऊं, आप ये देख रहे हैं, ये अंडर ब्रिज आप देख रहे हैं, ये गुजरात के अंडर ब्रिज के समय से इस वक्त प्रधानमंत्री का काफिला अहमदाबाद में, और ये अंडर ब्रिज जो है मैं आपको बताऊं आज आपको दिल्ली में दिखते हैं। मैंने आज के 20 साल पहले जब मैं रिपोर्टिंग करता था मैंने अहमदाबाद में इस तरह के अंडर ब्रिज देखे। तो अहमदाबाद के डेवलपमेंट की आप देखिए कि 20 साल पहले वहां इस तरह के कई अंडर ब्रिज बने थे जिससे लोगों को ट्रैफिक में तकलीफ ना, और यह प्रधानमंत्री का देखिए काफिला जो है ये आ रहा, और ये आप देखिए गाड़ी किस तरह से फूलों से सजी हुई है, जो एक कार दिख रही है। अभी हम प्रधानमंत्री जो है वहां नजर आएंगे, देखिए गाड़ी में प्रधानमंत्री बैठे हुए हैं दिख रहा है, और पीछे एक और जो है गाड़ी है जो फूलों से सजी हुई है, दोनों तरफ लोग खड़े हैं और प्रधानमंत्री को अभी लोग देखना चाहते हैं। तो आनंद जो आप कह रहे थे ना कि देखिए गुजरात बीजेपी के लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि वहां से गुजरात मॉडल की बीजेपी लगातार बात करती है, और इसीलिए जो है और प्रधानमंत्री का एक शैली है, वो लोगों से कनेक्ट बहुत जल्दी करते हैं। आप भी कई बार प्रधानमंत्री का आपने विदेश दौरे कवर किया, आपको मालूम है जब वो विदेशों में भी जाते हैं तो भारतवंशियों के बीच मिलने के लिए वहां पर सड़कों के किनारे जो इस तरह से लोग खड़े हो जाते हैं, भारतवंशी खड़े हो जाते हैं, तो वो अपने रोड शो के माध्यम से उन लोगों का अभिवादन करते हैं, लोगों के बीच जाते हैं। और गुजरात में इस वक्त सबसे बड़ा रोड शो करने का ये जो पूरा बीजेपी ने स्टार्ट, ये प्रधानमंत्री की पहली छवि आप देखिए, प्रधानमंत्री इस गाड़ी के काफिले में देखिए प्रधानमंत्री की पहली छवि इस वक्त जो रोड शो की, और इस तरह से आधिकारिक रूप से कह सकते हैं, आप ऑफिशियली कह सकते हैं इस रोड शो की शुरुआत हुई अब तक का सबसे बड़ा रोड शो। प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी बीजेपी की जो एक इस वक्त बीजेपी की टोपी लगाए हुए और फूलों से सजे इस कार में
भगवा कलर की कार भी है, वो रंग भी अपने आप में अशोक देखिए वो भी अपने आप में बड़ा महत्व रखता है, क्योंकि बीजेपी हर वो कोशिश करती है जिससे वो एक जुड़ाव महसूस कर सके और अपनी जो बात रखने का तरीका है वो कर सके। और प्रधानमंत्री उसकी पूरी टीम को अगवाकारी करते नजर आते हैं। वो शायद जिस बात का जिक्र कर रहे थे, गाड़ी नजर आ रही, प्रधानमंत्री खुद उस ओपन जीप में वहां पे मौजूद है। जाहिर सी बात है सीधे तौर पे लोगों से वो कनेक्ट कर सके, मिल सके, संवाद कर सके और उनका अभिवादन सहर्ष स्वीकार कर सके। और ये 52 किलोमीटर 50-52 किलोमीटर के रोड शो की अब शुरुआत हो गई और ये अपने आप में आज तक का सबसे बड़ा मेगा रोड शो होने जा रहा है, क्योंकि प्रधानमंत्री की कार्यशैली को जो लोग करीब से जानते हैं, जिसको आपने भी कई बार अशोक जी जिक्र किया है कि वो हमेशा बड़ा करने की बात करते हैं और उसमें विश्वास करते हैं। शायद इतना बड़ा रोड शो करने का मादा भी जैसे ही राजनीतिक शख्सियत की काबिलियत है शायद, जिस वजह से उन्होंने इतना बड़ा रोड शो के लिए वो निकले हैं।
जी, और आप ये देखिए अभी इससे पहले वो कलोल में एक छोटा रोड शो करके आ रहे हैं, छोटा रोड शो उन्होंने अभी कलोल में किया था, वहां भी लोगों के साथ उन्होंने कनेक्ट करने के लिए रोड शो किया। और आपने अभी भगवा गाड़ी की बात की ना, तो ये नहीं भूलना चाहिए गुजरात देश का पहला राज्य है जो पूरा भगवामय हो गया। ऐसा पहला राज्य है जिसने जो बीजेपी की इतनी बड़ा स्ट्रॉन्ग होल्ड बना और उसके बाद वहां से जो है बीजेपी का विस्तार हुआ। तो ये जो भगवा आप रंग देख रहे हैं, भगवा रंग की कार देख रहे हैं, ये भी अपने आप में एक सिंबॉलिक है। बीजेपी ने जिस तरह से गुजरात को भगवामय कर दिया, एक बार फिर से गुजरात जो है वो भगवामय हो जाए, उसी की कड़ी के लिए, उसी की चीज को आगे बढ़ाने के लिए ये प्रधानमंत्री का रोड शो है। और ये इस वक्त जो है प्रधानमंत्री का काफिला जो नरोडा गांव से जो निकला है, ये वो विधानसभा सीट है जहां बीजेपी स्ट्रॉन्ग होल्ड। और अरे देख, बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट बात है, ये आज का जो सफर है, आज का जो रोड शो है, ये मणिनगर विधानसभा सीट से भी निकलेगा। मणिनगर अहमदाबाद की वो विधानसभा सीट है जहां से, ये आप देखिए, ये है ताकत,
बहुमंजिला इमारत।
एग्जैक्टली, ये अभी आपने ये सूरत में भी नजारा देखा था। और ये प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की लोकप्रियता है। देखिए, सड़कों के किनारे आप लोग जमा हो जाते हैं, वो तो अलग बात है। लोग देखिए फूलों से प्रधानमंत्री के ऊपर पुष्प वर्षा कर रहे हैं, बिल्डिंगों में, बाजारों में, और जहां जहां आपको इमारतें दिखाई देंगी, उन इमारतों के ऊपर आपको लोग खड़े हुए दिखाएंगे। देखिए, आप नीचे आप भीड़ देखिए और आनंद ऊपर आप देखिए, जहां तक आपकी नजर जाएगी, जिन जिन इमारतों तक नजर जाएगी, वहां आपको सिर्फ और सिर्फ लोग दिखाई देंगे। और ये प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी को लेकर प्यार जो है, आप देखिए लोग कितने खुश हैं, चेहरे देखिए आप देखिए। ये कई बार लोग इस तरह के आरोप लगा देते हैं, अरे भीड़ जुटा ली जाती है, लेकिन आप जो लोग खड़े हैं सड़कों के किनारे, जब आप जरा उनका चेहरे देखिए, चेहरों की अभिव्यक्ति देखिए, उनके चेहरों पर फेस पर एक्सप्रेशन देखिए, ये वो लोग हैं जो प्रधानमंत्री के साथ अपना कनेक्ट महसूस करते हुए, उनको बस खबर लगनी चाहिए कि नरेंद्र मोदी आ रहे हैं, क्योंकि उनको गुजरात का बेटा माना जाता है और गुजरात का गौरव माना जाता है। गुजराती अस्मिता से जोड़ के गुजरात के लोग देखते हैं। इसीलिए जो है, जब लोगों को एक बार खबर लगती है बस नरेंद्र मोदी आ रहे हैं, उसके बाद लोग सड़कों पर उनका स्वागत करने के लिए उतर आते हैं। और बड़ी बात आरेंद्र ये भी है, मैं आपको ये भी बता दूं, प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जो है गुजरात के लोगों से इतना कनेक्ट है कि आज भी अगर वो किसी सड़क किनारे दिखेगा, सड़क के किनारे उनको कोई बीजेपी का पुराना कार्यकर्ता दिख जाएगा ना, तो कोई बड़ी बात नहीं कि उसका नाम लेकर उसको बोले कि हाँ कैसे हो, परिवार में सब ठीक है। अभी वो जब गए थे गुजरात में प्रचार करने के लिए, तो सीधा गांधीनगर के बीजेपी ऑफिस पहुंच गए और वहां जितने पुराने कार्यकर्ता थे उनके साथ बैठ के उन्होंने संवाद किया। और ऐसे कई कार्यकर्ता थे, ज्यादातर कार्यकर्ता ऐसे थे जिनको वो नाम से जानते थे, उनका नाम लेकर उनके परिवार का हालचाल पूछा। ये जो कनेक्ट है, इस कनेक्ट की जो तोड़ जो है विपक्ष के पास आज तक नहीं है।
बिल्कुल, और शायद इसीलिए ये एक महारत मानी जाती है, जिस प्रकार की जमीनी राजनीति करने वाले लोगों के साथ जुड़कर काम करने वाले और राजनीति को सेवा मारने की जो एक पूरी प्रक्रिया के तहत प्रधानमंत्री और उनकी टीम आगे बढ़ती है, और शायद इसीलिए इतना बड़ा जुड़ाव महसूस होता है। दुनिया में किसी भी मुल्क के सबसे बड़े हुए चुनाव में सबसे ज्यादा वोटों को हासिल करके दुनिया के सबसे बड़े लोकतंत्र के प्रधानमंत्री बनने का सौभाग्य हासिल करने वाले लगातार 2 बार प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी, उनका अपना गृह प्रदेश गुजरात, क्योंकि बीजेपी के लिहाज से गुजरात को एक सबसे बड़ी प्रयोगशाला के तौर पे कहा जाता है, जिसका जिक्र अभी आप अशोक कर रहे थे कि किस तरह से पूरा भगवामय हो गया था। यानी सारी सीटें लोकसभा के लिहाज से अगर कहा जाए तो बीजेपी के हिस्से आई थी। अपने आप में ये बताता है किस तरह से वहां से लगातार गुजरात से जो एक कोशिश की बीजेपी ने, वो न सिर्फ गुजरात बल्कि देश के अन्य राज्यों तक पहुंची, और शायद इसीलिए लगातार स्वीकारता बढ़ती हुई, एक वैश्विक नेता के छवि के तौर पर प्रधानमंत्री मोदी की स्वीकारता बढ़ती हुई, और हजारों की संख्या में लोग एक प्रधानमंत्री की झलक पाने के लिए दौड़ रहे हैं, और प्रधानमंत्री भी सहर्ष लोगों को स्वीकार रहे हैं। ये बहुमंजिला इमारतों की खिड़कियों में इंतजार करते हुए लोग, जिस बात का जिक्र आप कर रहे थे कि इंतजार भले ही कितनी देर करना पड़े, हम डटे हुए हैं। आइए मोदी जी,
एक बात और बहुत मैं आपको इंटरेस्टिंग और दिलचस्प बात बताऊं। देखिए, ये जो रोड शो का सिलसिला है, जो परंपरा है, ये प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी ने इसकी जो शुरुआत है राजनीतिक तौर पर, हालांकि वो राजनीतिक तौर पर अगर कहें तो कई यात्राओं से जुड़े रहे, चाहे वो कश्मीर की यात्रा हो जो जिसका नेतृत्व डॉक्टर मुरली मनोहर जोशी ने किया था, तत्कालीन बीजेपी अध्यक्ष थे, या फिर रामरथ यात्रा